Welcome to Lesche, a podcast on new ideas in ancient Greek studies. I'm your host, Johanna Hanning, and I'm a classicist at Brown University. In my first year of graduate school, I was lucky enough to see an exhibition called Alexandria's Sunken Treasures at the Grand Palais in Paris. It brought together about 500 objects recovered from the Bay of Alexandria by a team of archaeologists led by Frank Gaudio. The exhibition was memorable for many reasons. For one, I remember that the walls were completely covered in enormous projections of video footage showing scuba diving archaeologists at work. And this made the hall feel like something between a museum and an aquarium. I also remember how crowded it was. It was so crowded that it was really pretty hard to see many of the pieces. But really, this exhibition was most memorable for one particular work on display, one that took my breath away, and a piece of artwork that remains one of the most impressive things I have ever seen in person. This was a black granite statue identified by Gaudio as a representation of Afsaneh II, sister wife of King Ptolemy Philadelphus, and specifically, Gaudio saw this statue as representing Afsaneh in the guise of Aphrodite. Let me read you a description of the statue from the Egypt Museum, which is an online exhibition of Egyptian artifacts. The statue itself, I should note, is now housed in the Bibliotheca Alexandrina Antiquities Museum. But this is what the Egypt Museum people say about it. Afsaneh steps forth in the classical Egyptian striding pose, left foot forward, arms close to her sides. Yet her figure, draped in translucent robes that cling like sea mist, reveals the rounded grace and idealized beauty of Hellenistic Aphrodite. Her body is carved with an intimacy that evokes the famed wet drapery technique, the folds of fabric seeming to unveil rather than conceal, an artistic gesture as seductive as it is sacred. So this statue stands over life size at 2.25 meters, or about 7 feet 4.5 inches tall. It is now headless, and maybe that's part of its allure. In Paris, it stood on a pedestal, a tall pedestal, surrounded by such a dense ring of people that I could hardly get a good look. But 4 years later, by chance, I found myself in Cincinnati for the summer, where I was dragged, kind of rolling my eyes, to the Cincinnati Art Museum to see an exhibition called Cleopatra, the Search for the Last Queen of Egypt. And lo and behold, there she was again, in a corner, now displayed at ground level, nobody around her. That day, I got a full 20 minutes to stare at her undisturbed. And as far as I was concerned, the Cincinnati Art Museum had really buried the lead when they named that show after Cleopatra. It's hard to explain why I'm so enamored with this statue. I've never seen anything else like it. It's arrestingly, shockingly beautiful. Maybe my fondness for it also has to do with good memories of taking a Hellenistic art class back in grad school with people who went on to become lifelong friends and colleagues. But beyond the personal nostalgia element of this, what fascinates me is what the statue represents, the power and complexity of Hellenistic queenship. Afsaneh II wasn't just a royal consort, sister. She was a political actor, a divine figure, and a symbol of a dynasty ruling at the intersection of Greek and Egyptian and Macedonian traditions. The statue captures that layered identity in stone, showing us how queens like Afsaneh could shape their image to assert authority and embody ideals, and not just Greek ones, of beauty, fertility, and power. So questions like these about how female rulers represented themselves and were represented by others are at the heart of many ongoing debates in ancient history and art history, of course. And these are precisely the topics that my guest for this episode, Patricia Kim, takes up for the Hellenistic period in her new book, The Art of Queenship in the Hellenistic World. Patricia's work explores how queens used art and visual culture to craft their public personas, legitimize their rule, and navigate the male-dominated world of Hellenistic politics. Patricia's book is also the only monograph-length study devoted entirely to the art associated with Hellenistic queens. Patricia, or Tricia Kim, is assistant professor at New York University and author of The Art of Queenship in the Hellenistic World, which just came out with Cambridge University Press. It's the first book-length study on the visual and material cultures of queenship from the 4th to the 2nd centuries BCE across the Eastern Mediterranean and Western Asia. She is guest curator of a forthcoming exhibition on ancient queenship at both the Cincinnati Art Museum and the Getty Villa, and that exhibition is slated for 2027. Just a quick note that, as ever, I have put a few references in the show notes for this episode. I am also posting some images to accompany the episode on the Lesche Instagram account, which is at Lesche Podcast. That's also where I post announcements about new episodes, so if you are on Instagram, you might want to follow the podcast there. But enough of that. Now, I'd like to welcome into the Lesche Patricia, or Tricia, Kim. The next voice you'll be hearing is hers.
So I'll start by articulating the main argument of the book and what I see as the main intervention of the art of queenship in the Hellenistic world, which is to offer the first synthetic and book-length study of the art that includes different kinds of visual and material cultures that not only represent dynastic women, but also were patronized by dynastic women across the Hellenistic world. And what I argue is that the arts of Hellenistic queenship were actually vital to expressions of power across this vast landscape, including, or from the Eastern Mediterranean to Western Asia from the 4th to 2nd centuries BCE. These representations and expressions and spectacles, objects, monuments, it really is an eclectic corpus of data. But all of this data, these arts, expressed power by conveying dynastic legitimacy, continuity, and even imperial consolidation. So that's what I see as the main intervention and argument of this particular book, which started out as my dissertation at the University of Pennsylvania, where I worked primarily with, I have to give a shout out to Ann Kuttner and Brian Rose. So I decided on this topic when I was re-looking at some of the objects from the Vergina tombs of the Argead Macedonians. And there was this really weird chair or throne painted on it, Hades and Persephone, riding a chariot, right, going into kings and queens of the underworld, which is a topic and theme that the Macedonians were really interested and invested in. And then a thought occurred to me, wow, this is such an interesting sort of mythologized evocation of not just kingship, but also queenship. And so that one object got me thinking about how was queenship represented and articulated across various contexts throughout the Hellenistic world. And so that's how this project came to be. And I'll just stop there.
So you're mentioning this is the so-called Eurydice's throne, right? The marble throne from the tomb.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Yeah, we might be able to put an image of that on the Instagram so people can see. How did the project evolve over time? You look at 3 dynasties, let's say broadly speaking. Once you get into the Hellenistic material, you have material from that sets it up, but then you get into the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Attalids. Yeah. Had you always envisioned a structure like that, or did that come about later?
That structure came about later. That structure came about in response to what the data and what the evidence looked like. And what's unique about my book is that even though it is about the Hellenistic world, which for modern historians begins at 323 and ends around 30 BCE with the deaths of Alexander the Great and Cleopatra the Great, respectively, one of the things that I was starting to notice in the visual culture, and this is not just my particular finding, this is something that I think historians and art historians, as well as archaeologists alike, have all stated, which is that this sort of phenomena, both political phenomena, but also art historical phenomena that we see in the record that we attribute to Hellenism or the Hellenistic period seems to begin much earlier, at the beginning of the 4th century BCE. Now, this isn't a particular argument that I would consider as a main intervention of my book, but it does provide a sort of historical framework for the chapters that you'll see not only in the monograph, but also in the dissertation project. So you'll notice that the first chapter begins with the beginning of the 4th century. So that includes the dynasts of Caria, the Hecatomnid dynasts of Caria, 4th century dynasts of Sparta, 4th century dynasts of Lesche. Oh, and of course, the 4th century dynasts of the Argead dynasts of Macedonia, And you'll find some of the trends and themes and frameworks for thinking about queenship forming and emerging during that period. So I would say that what we see in the early 4th century becomes a really important foundation for the arguments that unfold for my chapters on the Ptolemies, Attalids, and Seleucids.
Well, I definitely want to ask you a little bit about these precursors, if that's not too tendentious a term. Sure. But before that, I'm wondering why it took so long, do you think, for a book on this topic to exist? Because I was mentioning in the pre-recording that I had taken a Hellenistic art seminar with Andrew Stewart at Berkeley, who wrote Faces of Power, a book that really, I just remember analyzing everything about the Alexander representations and then getting into the coins of the successors and getting into, the portraits and things. I mean, Hellenistic kingship has been so studied. What do you think prevented people from looking at the archive with this rubric of queenship in mind?
So one of the things that I must state is that historians of the Hellenistic period in particular have done a really amazing job of trying to illuminate and articulate what was Hellenistic queenship. Was there such a thing as queenship? A lot of these questions were or have been approached biographically, but now more so synthetically, conceptually by folks like Elizabeth Carney or Sheila Ager, Sabine Müller. The list really goes on. I'm not citing everyone who's done this work, but for the past several decades, historians who've dealt with literary sources in particular, and some archaeological and art historical sources have addressed Hellenistic queenship. So I see my work as building on those conversations, although readers will find that my conclusions, not about the nature of queenship as such, but rather I'm an art historian, right? So the arguments, my methods are primarily art historical. But as far as the sort of world of art history and archaeology, you're absolutely correct. It has taken more than a century for a scholarly monograph on the art of queenship in the Hellenistic world to emerge. And here, Andy Stewart, who was also my mentor when I was a student at Berkeley, Bert Smith is another really important art historian who's contributed, I think, quite a bit to this particular field, have focused primarily on kingship. I wonder if it has to do with two things. The first is the data itself. And this is something that historians that have worked on Hellenistic queenship would actually say, which is that the sources seem to talk about the biographies and histories of kings and dynasts just more, right? There's just more for kings. And that certainly is the case, I think, for visual and material culture as well. The second has to do with our own field and our own discipline, right? Which is to say, what are the methods for dealing with the fragmentary and also for dealing with the unevenness in terms of visual material culture that we see if we compare, for instance, representations of Ptolemaic queens to representations of Seleucid queens, right? So there's this sort of discrepancy in what the data sort of looks like to begin with. And then the other sort of thing that I wonder is that typically, well, let's go back to Stewart and to Smith's two very important and foundational monographs on Hellenistic royal art. Both of those really do focus on portraiture. And in fact, I have a funny anecdote. When I was in graduate school and I was working as a volunteer at a gallery, a woman who got her master's in ancient art asked me what my dissertation topic was, and I told her, I'm going to work on Hellenistic queens. And she said, well, good luck with that. There are no portraits of Hellenistic queens, so I don't know, but, good luck. Essentially, the subtext of that being like, you're not going to be able to do it. There's not enough data. And so I think that by shifting away or sort of rethinking what our own expectations are for royal art, that was one of the first steps that I had to take when I was working on my dissertation in order to even attempt a book-length project on this particular subject.
So in terms of methodology, then, and of course there is portraiture, there is some portraiture, but you draw on a really broad archive. And I was struck by that, but you are very creative, I think, in the way that you construct your archive and in what you see as part of your archive. Could you give the listeners a little bit of a sense of what is in that archive? What kinds of sources do you draw on beyond the portraiture that does exist?
I mean, yes, of course, there are portraits. Obviously, these are conceptual portraits, or maybe it's not obvious. These portraits appear across a variety of different styles and techniques. Some of them are entirely new styles, sort of these hallmarks of what's different and what's new and difficult and exciting about Hellenistic art history. And there are some contexts in which, as I mentioned, there aren't as many what we would identify as portraits, that is, figural representations of historical individuals. And so we have a lot of portraits from the Ptolemaic context. We don't have so many portraits from the Seleucid context. Mm-hmm. There are different ways we can theorize the absence and presence of portraiture, but the point is that if you look at what is extant, that seems to be the case. Now, that isn't to say that the Seleucid world didn't represent or produce figural representations or figural portrayals of queenship or embodiments of queenship. It's just that I tend to be skeptical about whether or not those particular representations that appear, for instance, on coinage or on sealings are in fact identifiable historical figures at all, or if that was even the point. So I think that's one of the things that my close examination of these different dynasties has generated, right? Which is a different way of looking at the figural. But to go back to your question about the range of sources and the range of different kinds of data, I'm looking at, for instance, different kinds of objects at a variety of different scales, produced in different materials. Some of these things don't even exist anymore. So from the very small scale, including glyptic evidence, coins I've mentioned, to the very large monuments, including tumuli and the so-called Great Altar of Pergamon. A lot of these objects, by the way, are artworks, right, have already been published and studied to death. The Great Altar of Pergamon is one such object. But by sort of reorienting these familiar objects through the lens of queenship, both locally but also sort of synthetically, that is to say, in comparison with what else is happening across the Hellenistic world, I think there's some really exciting ways to think about these older materials in new ways. I mentioned works that don't seem to exist anymore, including the Philippeion, or the so-called Philippeion, the rotunda that was built in the 4th century at the Altus of Olympia, perhaps to celebrate one of Philip II, the Argead king of Macedon at the time, one of his battles. But what's also very unique about that particular monument is that you're trying to sort of speculatively reimagine or imagine what this thing could have looked like, given the fact that Pausanias is our only... Well, actually, that's not true. Pausanias is our only full-on description, let's say, ekphrastic description of what this monument looked like. Of course, there is archaeological evidence for the pedestal and the rotunda itself. What I mean is that the statues do not exist any longer. That's not to say that other scholars haven't looked at the Philippeion or haven't commented on the two female kin members that were included in the monument that Philip built, but rather to reframe that monument as part of this sort of broader phenomenon that we begin to see in the 4th century, which is to sort of represent queens and embodiments of queenship in expressions of royal and dynastic power more broadly. So that's to give you a sense that I hope that gives a good sense of the range of different kinds of evidence that I was dealing with. And of course, right, epigraphic evidence, so bases, stelae and decrees, and trying to read creatively into our epigraphic sources.
So you mentioned the Philippian just now, and you also have a very interesting reading of the Mausoleum, which you mentioned the Hecatonids and of Caria. Could you maybe speak a little bit about what developments do we see in the 4th century? What is the landscape and what are the kind of stirrings, I guess, of representations of queenship or conceptualizations of queenship that we see even before the traditional advent of the Hellenistic age with, I don't know, Alexander's marauding army or whatever. What's going on before that?
So the 4th century, the early 4th century BCE, historians describe as the period of Achaemenid Persian power. Of course, like the extent of that power is waning by the 4th century. And this is a debate that historians of the Achaemenid world often like to engage in. But that's a really important context. Actually, I was talking to a scholar, and she described the Hellenistic world as a copy and paste of the Achaemenid world. So, in fact, what's happening in the Achaemenid period, what's happening between the 6th and the 4th centuries is actually quite important in terms of contextualizing the early Hellenistic period. But in any case, if you look at Achaemenid Persian art, which is where I'll start, a lot of the sort of palatial art that's come to characterize Achaemenid royal art is very male-centric. So, for instance, the reliefs at Persepolis, you have the figure of the king, his attendants, and then all of the sort of faithful members of this empire coexisting in peace, bringing tribute to the king. They're also gendered as men. And this is not to say that during the Achaemenid period, there were no representations of royal women or elite high-ranking women ever. Clearly, that's not the case. We have things like the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which was technically built in or during the period of the Achaemenid Empire. But that's to say that there seems to be, at least in terms of our extant art historical records, this resistance to representing or even naming women as patrons of royal art, which is a shift that we see in particular in the Aegean world in the early 4th century BCE. So again, this is not to say that royal women didn't appear or they didn't have or wield economic power. Scholars like Maria Brosius have done excellent work mining through different cuneiform sources and different kinds of textual evidence to show that Achaemenid women did manage their own estates and so on and so forth. There are some examples of glyptic evidence that may represent figural bodies of royal women. But as far as the art historical evidence goes, or the visual evidence goes, that seems to be it. In the 4th century, as I mentioned, in Anatolia, or in the Aegean world in particular, we start to see this interesting dynamic happen politically, which is to say that a lot of different sort of dynasts pop up, try to consolidate their own territories, all while looking askance or directly at the Achaemenid overlords in the central Fars province. But in any case, as this is happening, they're also producing and commissioning and paying for monuments that declare their own dynastic legitimacy within the regions over which they are trying to rule. So, Lycian dynasts in what is now southwest Turkey. I mentioned the Argeads of Macedon as another example. And then, of course, the Hecatonids of Caria, also in southwest Turkey. And this is really an interesting moment art historically, because the monuments that they're producing aren't just, here's a statue of me and I'm a king and I'm great and I'm hunting and I'm hanging out and drinking with my buddies, which is a common visual trope of masculinity and of power in the 4th century BCE, something that Ada Cohen and Hallie Franks have written about in their own work. But they also start to feature dynastic women themes of dynastic femininity, representations of queens even. And the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus is one really important example in which we see this. So the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, which was built around the middle of the 4th century BCE, intended as the tomb for the dynast Mausolus, was named as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Its extant sculpture is split between Bodrum and London, and described by both Vitruvius and Pliny as these feats in not only architecture, but also in sculptural practice. Also included this ancestor gallery in which there are both male and female dynastic kin members that are related to the Hecatomnic clan, that were related to Mausolus. Now, how do we know this? We know this because we have extant sculptural fragments, life-size or over life-size sculptural fragments that seem to be body parts that would have belonged to a high-ranking dynastic, royal, or dynastic Hecatomnic woman. So what do I mean by that? Veils, fragments of heads, right, with the sort of characteristic snail coil curls, with a sakos cap that's very characteristic of Hecatomnid elite and dynastic women. And so this is pretty much widely accepted by art historians. But the fact that this is happening in such a large-scale monument, petrified in stone, is something that I think needs, or was something that I thought and I felt needed further attention and framing in terms of the rubric of Hellenistic queenship that I sought to kind of articulate and flesh out. There was also this interesting theory posited by George Waywell, so to back up, our historical sources that describe the mausoleum talk about a chariot that sort of topped or crowned the monument. And based on sculptural fragments and scholarly work, George Waywell basically speculated that the chariot would have been large enough to carry 2 over life-size figures. And so that's when he first suggested that perhaps this chariot was led not just by Mausolus, but by his sister and wife, Artemisia II, which would be a really interesting and exciting for me if that is indeed true, right? To sort of imagine that Mausolus's power and Mausolus's sort of dynastic identity is expressed via the royal couple imagery. But whether or not that's true, that's less important. We know that this monument cared to represent dynastic women in such a intentional, monumental way. And I think that those themes of kinship, of continuity, of legitimacy, and even of futurity, right? These expectations for continuity, these are all themes that we continue to see after the historian's official beginning of the Hellenistic period emerges.
So do you think that in these cases that you mentioned, so with the Argiads and the Hecatomnids and Caria, and then in your book, even in Sparta, the situation, is Persia, I guess I'm wondering, at some root of what is strikingly happening all over the Eastern, Mediterranean in the 4th century?
So yes and no, right? So I think it's definitely the case that folks are looking to Persia and looking at Persia. I mean, and this is a phenomenon that we know begins earlier, right, than the 4th century BCE, that there's this sort of emulation of Persian royal art or Achaemenid art. The Achaemenid koine, cultural koine, which is how some scholars describe it. But then there's also this sort of rejection at the same time that has to do with, or that's tied up with ideas around Greekness or ideas around cultural identity. So yes, but also no, right? Because the Achaemenid Persians are not necessarily representing their royal women in dynastic art, in visual and material culture. That's not to say that they weren't, or they didn't have their own, I mean, I'm like kind of hesitant to use this word, but I'm going to put in air quotes, agency, right? Or their own kind of power that they wielded at court, right? And in fact, actually, this book, by the way, isn't an argument that Hellenistic queens had a lot of agency and had a lot of power, right? And that they were these feminists that ruled. And in fact, I would argue perhaps that that was not the case at all, that was very rare. But there's just something about the representation of dynastic femininity at the beginning of the 4th century, which continues throughout the Hellenistic period, that becomes important to these different dynastic courts, kingdoms, and empires that we see across this vast geography. All of these dynasts are fighting each other. They're also marrying into each other's dynasties, and they're looking at each other and they're emulating each other. And so I think that's what's really fascinating about this period, as opposed to what we see in the Achaemenid record, which is that dynastic women, royal women, dynastic femininity seems to feature as a broader part of these ideological and aesthetic projects than they did before the Hellenistic period or before the 4th century.
So what is it, moving ahead then, what is it that happens in Ptolemaic Egypt where the representation of queenship just really takes off in all directions? And I think like these names like Arsinoe or, sorry, the dog is groaning. These names like Arsinoe or Berenike or, well, Cleopatra, for example. I mean, these are all, among classicists, I guess household names, if you can put it like that. So what is it that happens in Ptolemaic Egypt where it's just becomes so important a part of the dynastic representation is to have these queens celebrated?
Yeah, that's a really great question that I sought out to answer. Or one of the things that I sought out to answer looking at the visual and material culture, there is a stark change between what we see with the beginning of the Ptolemaic period and before the Ptolemaic period. So we see for the first time royal women, their figural representations in these monumental temple reliefs. We have for the first time these dynastic cults. So, for instance, Arsinoe II, who's a Macedonian Ptolemaic queen who marries her brother, Ptolemy II. At the beginning of the 3rd century BCE, she gets her own cult. Those two get their own brother-sister cult. And the reason why their cult is so important, or her cult is so important, is that this is it generates the contexts for the production of her image across so many different contexts, across different materials, scales, styles, and techniques, not just in Egypt, but of course across the Eastern Mediterranean, for which we have evidence for her cult being exported, or perhaps maybe folks who are loyal to the Ptolemies traveling. But in any case, the Ptolemies are not the only ones who are investing in royal cults or the posthumous worship in particular of individual dynasts and dynastic women. This is something that we see in the Attalid world, the Seleucid world, and so on. So, and this is truly something that's particular about the Hellenistic period, is that you have the worship of not just the syncretism or rather the linking between individual dynasts and popular gods and goddesses like Aphrodite or Isis, but the generation of their own cults, and with that a system, an ideological system and an aesthetic world, right, in which cultic practice can unfold.
So you just mentioned Aphrodite and Isis, and I guess that leads me to ask what sorts of, or how perhaps they drew on those goddesses for the iconographic language of representation of the queens.
Yeah, that's a really important question, because in fact, a lot of representations, iconographic figural representations of Ptolemaic queens really lean on goddess imagery. And this is important because Aphrodite and Isis are not only goddesses of beauty and sex and love, right, which is related to marriage and fecundity and helps to kind of reaffirm the political responsibility that these queens have to reproduce, right, on behalf of the dynasty, but they're also really importantly associated with water. And so we have, for instance, great epigrams by Poseidipists, for example, who talk about or imagine both men and women worshiping at the temple of Arsinoe as Aphrodite at Cape Zephyrion, which is, I think, about 40 kilometers or so away from Alexandria. But in any case, there are not only implications for what idealized femininity and what a queen's political responsibilities are, in terms of these link with goddesses like Aphrodite and Isis. But if you zoom out, these sort of broader imperial stakes in terms of sort of their naval power, that these linkages with these particular goddesses, I think, seem to matter. In terms of the actual iconography, there's this really, the cover of the book, you'll see, is this head of a Ptolemaic queen from the Walters Museum in Baltimore, dated to the late 3rd century BCE. And what's really fascinating about this is that you'll see it's this sort of typical Hellenizing or Greek style representation of an idealized head of a woman. You'll see her hair, sort of this wavy hair that we can imagine is pulled back into a chignon or a bun at the nape of her neck. And then over this hair, we have these coils, these ringlets. And to me, this looks like a wig, right? And typically in scholarship, we call this the Isis wig. Now, the direction of transfer, right? That is to say, did Ptolemaic queens first appear with this wig, and then it seemed to transfer onto representations of Isis later? Or was this wig originally associated with the goddess Isis and then picked up by queens? That is actually a point of debate. I'm pretty ambivalent, actually, if I can just admit myself, about that debate around transference. But I think the fact that those linkages did exist, and that the hair of this goddess or the hair of queenship is shared with the hair of this very important goddess in Egypt and to the Ptolemaic dynasty, I think really matters in terms of the development of figural representations.
How much of this manner of representation was directed then and pulling from the visual idiom of the indigenous Egyptian population?
A lot of it, I would say. A lot of it pulls from the local Egyptian idiom, both in terms of what artists thought Egyptian art would look like, but also the context in which royal art was produced was controlled primarily by the Egyptian temple complex. So one of the really cool things that I came across in my research was a stela in which they're celebrating some victory in battle. And what they say is that, okay, now I command, or this royal decree commands, that statues of Berenike, I think, be set up in all the temples in the land in the manner of Egyptian style, right? So what Egyptian style meant to the Ptolemies is something that we can guesstimate, right?
Presumably it's more than just the relative length of the first toes.
Exactly. But we can sort of speculate on what that means. Does that mean the sort of hard stone material? Does that mean the particular kinds of proportions that are used, the poses and the posturing? An Egyptologist who works on pharaonic art would say that any art from the Ptolemaic world just looks totally bizarre and is not Egyptian at all. But the fact of the matter is that even though to our eyes, our modern scholarly eyes, stylistically Ptolemaic art or Egyptianizing Ptolemaic art might look different than what pharaonic Egyptian art of the 2nd millennium BCE looked like that actually doesn't matter. That there is a particular stylistic language, a materiality that signals Egypt, right, or Egyptianness to the Ptolemies that I think is worth stating and thinking about. And then I mentioned that it's the Egyptian temple complex that, in fact, managed and was responsible for overseeing production workshops for portraits in particular, but a number of different kinds of things, but portraits for royal Ptolemaic individuals. And so that is something, the relationship between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Egyptian temples is something that other Ptolemaic historians have talked about at length, but certainly that matters in response to the question that you're asking. And, just in terms of like logistics, it makes sense. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there is presumably a kind of know-how, or let's say a pre-established knowledge system for how things work, right? Or that is to say, what a good image looks like, what a good royal image looks like, what's appropriate for a religious context.
Right, because they're not being created in a vacuum. Right, presumably they're drawing on a lot of local creativity, artistic labor. Right,
Absolutely. And this is attested archaeologically at quarry sites, for instance, quarry sites that had functioned for royal sculpture production for hundreds, thousands of years, where we have graffiti, right, from the Hellenistic period. And so we know that there's a fair amount of continuity that's happening. Nevertheless, at the same time, don't forget that the Ptolemies are, like the Attalids, are famous, right, among scholars now and scholars in antiquity for being patrons of innovation. Okay, and so there seems to be, first of all, if you just look at the cover of my image, there seems to be image production and artistic production that seems to respond to the particularities of that cultural moment of encounter and of engagement that, by the way, isn't unique to the Hellenistic period. People have been engaging. They have been encountering each other across the Mediterranean and Western Asia for millennia. Chris Parmenter's recent book on racialized commodities sort of speaks to this at length. But what I wanted to say was to really think about the fact that the production of royal art and royal or representations of royal women in particular seems to be a site of genuine creativity, and if I may use this word a little anachronistically, innovation. So, for instance, I start out in my book with an anecdote from Pliny, who talks about this sort of plan between Ptolemy II and this architect named Timacharis, in which they would create this image of Arsinoe II floating midair in her temple at Alexandria. And that how they would use lodestone, which is this mineral with magnetic properties, to suspend her iron, architecturally that is, right, in order to create the effect of a floating portrait statue, which would have been made out of iron. Now, Pliny goes on to say, okay, these plans never happened because everyone died too soon. So,
But it would have been cool.
But it would have been really cool. It would have been really freaky, right? It would have sort of added to this kind of like spectacle of divine queenship for sure. But the point is, it doesn't matter if it was really happening or not, or if it really happened or what, that's less interesting. What's interesting is that there's this sense of like, okay, there are some innovative things happening artistically, architecturally. There's this great interest in sort of thinking about different materials and materiality that I think is worth calling out, right? Especially in the Hellenistic context. I could go on and on about this, but I'll stop there.
So you mentioned the Attalids and their fame and penchant for innovation. Could you maybe by way of comparison and contrast with what you were saying about the Ptolemies, speak a little bit about how the Attalids were representing queenship? And in particular, you frame your chapter around royal motherhood. And I think that would be really interesting to hear about.
Yeah. So the Attalids are picking up on some of the same themes that the Ptolemies are absolutely expressing in their kind of articulations of queenship. So themes about motherhood, about the family, about what the political role and responsibility of a dynastic woman is. These are, I would say, shared between not just the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, but also the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, the Attalids, the Antigonids, and so on, right? All of these dynasties are sort of responding to and participating in a similar kind of ideological project. The thing is that they're doing it in very different ways, right? Which goes back to my earlier point that you can't look for the same things across these different regions and zones. Because they're responding to, first of all, different traditions and histories and cultures that are pre-existing, but also they're just doing different things in response to the particular moments in which they're ruling. So what I find most interesting about Adelaide queenship, and this is something that other scholars, other Hellenistic historians have discussed in length, is their emphasis on motherhood, right? In fact, so much so that we have the Queen Apollonius in the sort of evidence for, or the epigraphic evidence that attests to the various public honors that were created on behalf of her and on behalf of on behalf of the Adelaide dynasty. They really emphasize her regard and her affection, right? Affection, philostorgia, affection for her husband, affection for her sons. So much so that I would say that this notion of affection becomes thematized, or motherly affection becomes thematized in a lot of these dynastic expressions. For those of you who are interested in the Seleucid context, we see this we see similar things, except in the Seleucid context, sororal affection is what seems to be thematized in that particular context. But in any case, we have less figural representations, less portraits, right? So you're not going to get like those cool anecdotes from Pliny about the Adelaides experimenting with different kinds of portraiture and different kinds of materials. But what I find interesting about the Adelaides and Seleucids also in particular is their manipulation of different kinds of spaces, right? And so what I mean by that is architectural spaces, these sort of cultural political spaces in which the presence and the patronage and the importance of these dynastic figures, these dynastic women in particular, are really made manifest and materially present. So one example of this is Apollonius and her really, I would say, extraordinary expansion of the sanctuary to Demeter at Pergamon, right, within the palatial city, expanding it so that potentially hundreds and hundreds of women and girls are able to participate in a variety of different kind of cultic activity there. Demeter, of course, right, is a really important motherly goddess herself. There's also really interesting, I think one of the arguments that I make in my book, in this chapter on the Adelaides, is that not all of the work is biographical, right? That is to say, it's not always about one particular figure, like Apollonius, but rather about the themes of queenly motherhood that emerge in monuments like the Great Altar at Pergamon, which has been talked about in terms of, right, the sort of gigantomachy and the emergence of this dramatic Baroque Hellenistic style, nodding back to Andy Stewart, or, more recently by Kristen Seaman in terms of what this tells us about visual narrative and the telephos relief. But one of the arguments that I make in my book about the telephos relief in particular is that this is not just a sort of biographical sort of sketch of this mythologized figure telephos, but it also serves as this kind of biographical sketch of his mother Ager, right, who was this priestess of the Aphrodite cult who was sort of banished from Arcadia to Mysia, and then, basically learns that is either married to, or she's either married off to or adopted as a royal daughter of the king of Mysia, and then later finds out that Telephos is her son, right? So there's this whole sort of dramatic unfolding, both in the myth itself, but also in the frieze. But what I argue is that a lot of these panels, or at least enough of these panels are about Ager's story, and about the sort of kind of realization that she is the mother of Telephos, that seems to be missing in a lot of the scholarship on the Great Altar. That to me, when you read in the context of the Adelaide emphasis on motherly affection and queenly motherhood, that needs to, right, that was just super fascinating to me and could be best explained and framed in terms of queenship as well.
So ultimately then, Tricia, what do you think stands to be gained from considering queenship in particular? At the beginning of this conversation, we mentioned that there have been these monograph-length studies of royal portraiture in the Hellenistic period or royal art connected to the dynasties. But what do you think, stands to be gained, I suppose, ultimately from carving out queenship as its own rubric?
Sure. I mean, three things come to mind. The first is basically repeating back to you what your question is, which is to say that queenship is worth looking at. It is a category that sort of merits analysis. So kind of filling in the historiographic gaps, if you will, is something that I think this book does. I mean, I just have to say that even though I do not claim and I do not think that much or many of these royal women had any kind of political agency or power. These are highly patriarchal. These are authoritarian patriarchal societies, right? That I hope that my intervention is sort of, if I may call it, a feminist one still, nevertheless, or rather that it does contribute to feminist art history. It does contribute to classical art history in that I'm looking at a particular category, a particular demographic that just has been mostly, I think, ignored in our scholarship, in our art historical scholarship, because for whatever reasons, right? Because the methods don't exist, the evidence don't exist, right? And so sort of thinking creatively about how to approach the fragmentary and the uneven across this large swath of land. And so then the second thing that I hope folks take away from this project, or, the conversation that I hope that this sparks, is about gender categories to begin with. So historian Afsaneh Najmabadi has this really great article about, is gender a useful category of analysis beyond the Americas? And, this is something that I want us to continue to think about. Not that women and men are sort of these kind of given gender categories, but rather how is the category of woman, and in my case, the category of elite royal woman, formed, constructed, and then projected out into the world. And then finally, I think that this book is useful for folks who are interested in kind of what we call global antiquities or global approaches to antiquity. Because even though this book, I think, is being marketed as a contribution to classical art and archaeology, which it is, it also, I see it as hopefully, a contribution to Anatolian art and art history, to Egyptian art and its histories, to West Asian or Near Eastern art and its histories. And I hope that it continues to spark debate and conversation and even disagreements about entanglements and encounters, and how it is that we can even attempt to do a synthetic study of this really complicated matrix that we call the Hellenistic world.
Thank you so much, Tricia. I'm wondering if you might be willing to share with listeners maybe something you've been reading or watching or listening to or thinking about that has been bringing you some joy lately.
Well, I am expecting my first child. So that's bringing a lot of different kinds of stress, but also a lot of joy in terms of our growing family. And so just a lot of my own energy is devoted to that. But another thing that I've been working on that I'm really exciting that is coming out in 2027 is an exhibition called On Ancient Queenship. That covers the first millennium and also first millennium BCE, that is. That also includes sort of modern and contemporary adaptations and appropriations of ancient queenship. That is set to go live to the public in 2027. It'll start at the Getty Villa and then travel to the Cincinnati Art Museum. So that's something that I'm really looking forward to.
That's great. Well, Tricia, thank you so much for doing the podcast. Congratulations on the publication of the book, which just reached your hands in physical form today, I understand.
Yes, yes.
So that's a birthday in another kind of way.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Well, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much, Johanna. This was fun. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Lesche podcast, and special thanks for their support of the podcast to the Brown University Department of Classics and the John Nicholas Brown Center for Advanced Study. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. And we'd be grateful if you take a moment to rate the podcast and leave a review. It will help other listeners to find us. We look forward to you joining us again soon here in the Lesche.